Welcome to Mom and Mine, where we dive into all aspects of perinatal mental health and wellness related to pregnancy, birth, loss, postpartum, and new parenthood. It's so much more than postpartum depression. We raise the volume on all of these topics in the hopes that someday everyone will have the support and info that they deserve before they need it. Please note this podcast is not a replacement for treatment by a professional or professional training. Welcome to Mom and Mine. I'm Dr. Kat. In our episode today, I am joined by guest Emily Adler Mosqueda, who's going to be talking about her personal experience through postpartum depression after her second child. She experienced postpartum depression late in her second postpartum, and since then has become an advocate for mothers and the postpartum time. She's going to be touching on what it felt like for her to be going through postpartum depression with a second child and feeling less support than she felt with her first child. She's also going to be talking about what it felt like to come to terms with having postpartum depression and realizing it at around 8 months. And very specifically, how her profession shaped and was shaped by her experience. Emily is a bilingual pediatric speech-language pathologist, associate clinical professor, and lead clinician of the Young Child Center at the University of Oregon. She is a mother of 2 young daughters. She has become an advocate for mothers in the postpartum time. Emily teaches about parental mental health factors as they relate to communication disorders to her graduate students. She hopes to help shift the cultural understanding of how long the postpartum time is and the issues that can and do arise after 6 months postpartum. She has completed a memoir manuscript about her postpartum journey, and she will be sharing some of her experience with us today. She has also authored free bilingual children's books, one called My Big Feelings and one called The Big Bad Virus. She also shares with us a little bit of insight to what normal language development is for babies, which I think will be really useful for especially all of the anxious parents to hear, and give some really, really sound advice and perspective on how to help your child with language development if you yourself are suffering and not feeling like you're able to engage with your child the way you'd like to. So let's get right in and meet Emily. Welcome, Emily. Thank you so much for being with us.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited to get your perspective and hear your experience on our episode today. I'm sure you'll bring a really valuable perspective to a lot of our parents based on your profession. But certainly, I would love for you to start wherever you're comfortable with your personal story.
Sure. It was with my second daughter that things went awry, or just I really kind of had the biggest breakdown of my life to have some really big breakthroughs. My husband and I had some assumptions about being repeat parents that we definitely knew more what we were doing the second time than we did the first time. And we're making some adjustments of what we had learned with our first daughter, with our second, and we're kind of cruising along. And, the typical 4th trimester had some bumps in it, but nothing significant. And I went back to work, and then things really started to kind of crack more regularly. And then it was really at 8 months postpartum that everything kind of had to come to a screeching halt. I had to take a leave of absence from my job. I was so sleep deprived, and I really couldn't function that well. And we really started to kind of gather the wagons and see, okay, what did I need? We considered having me start pharmaceutical medication. I definitely needed some supports, and I'm a really sensitive person. And so we knew that a pharmaceutical response was possible, but we wanted to try some natural things first. My husband's a doctor of Chinese medicine, and we hadn't really looked at the situation for what it really was, that I was physically, emotionally, spiritually depleted. And so we kind of went to work getting me well. I started doing regular counseling. I had acupuncture really regularly, found out my adrenals were really shot from having the baby. I also started writing a lot because I was finding myself in this headspace that was really unfamiliar to me and scary. And then also being trained as a scientist, as a speech language pathologist, I was trained to ask a lot of questions. And so I did that and turned it to myself. I'm like, okay, how did I get here? What went awry? How was this birth different than my first birth? And okay, I had Pitocin way more than I pretty much didn't have it with my first birth. Okay, what's the relationship between Pitocin and depression? And I was like, okay, I have a question to pose, so I went to the research and found some answers. And I was like, oh my gosh. So I really started educating myself to get myself through this really dark time, as well as writing about it, because I was just needing to kind of process it in a deep way. And I was uncovering a lot of personal realizations of my upbringing and my childhood and my cultural identity and all these things that just, I guess, were ripe for looking at when you've had a second child. And it was surprising that it was so late. It's like, why is no one talking about this? And why wouldn't a woman who has depression symptoms, 8, 9, 14 months postpartum, have it not automatically be related to their pregnancy? Unfortunately, because of my husband's medical background and vantage point that is different than Western medicine, he's like, it makes perfect sense that it's related to your pregnancy. And I'm so grateful that he has and had that knowing and the skill set to share with me and help the women in his own practice. So
yeah, absolutely.
So since that big experience, I've been, writing about it. I'm hoping to publish a memoir about the research that I found and the things that I thought about. I kind of met my inner critic and befriended my inner child, and kind of saw how all these players in my mind could be there to help me and support me once I knew what they were.
Right, for sure.
And I also wanted to support other moms. I mean, being a pediatric speech language pathologist, I started to be worried at that 8-month, 9-month mark for my own child, of like, oh my gosh, like I'm not able to give her the language input that I want to be, and that I gave to her sister. What do I do about that? So that became a big job for me, in the sense of a priority, more so a priority. And that was something else that, besides taking care of myself, I wanted to be sure that our second daughter that her language development was attended to.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would love to ask a couple of questions about your journey and how it unfolded in and around that 8-month postpartum mark. After you had, had some time to reflect and heal a little bit, what are some key factors that contributed to this later onset for you?
I was in denial that I suffered from depression. I, since high school, had dealt with seasonal depression, and I thought because it was seasonal, it didn't categorize me as having depression. It was the stigma of having depression or being someone who was depressed is big. Yep. And I didn't disclose to my practitioners that I suffer from depression. So I think that kind of set me up to not have me be on their radar. My depressive episodes would not be something that I would show or talk about. And so it was kind of secret, even to myself in a way. So I think that cumulative sleep disruption and disturbance. I mean, the newborn time is something, but then there's different sleep regressions, and then going to work. And I had a 3-year-old, another child, and it was just not getting enough sleep was not, just that doesn't work. Right. Sleep is so paramount and so foundational to everything. And then I had a lot of just like historical, I guess I can say it's historical, I'm still a work in progress, of perfectionism. And I think different cultural understandings, family culture, and understandings of what it meant to be a mother and what I was responsible for, and that I needed to do everything, and that asking for help, it was physically challenging. Like it gave me physical, it was like, it's even hard to say, like it was hard for me to ask for help.
Yeah.
And it's gotten easier to override my inclination of the voice inside to say, you don't need to do that. You're, good mothers don't do that. I mean, just these lies that my critic was telling me. And then to identify the source of those things of like, oh, it's my inner critic. It's not, I mean, it's real in the sense of my perception, but they're not really real.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So I think there's kind of that trifecta. And having had already been a parent, I really felt that our Western culture was like very hands-off. Like, you're a second-time parent. You've done this before. You should know what you're doing, highlighting the should. And you wanted to have another child. So you should be able to handle it. I felt like that was also kind of, I don't know, in my family, like complaining is not, you don't complain. And so I felt like if I shared my struggles, I would be complaining, and that I didn't want to be someone who complained or be perceived as someone who complained. So
yeah, it's a lot of pressure.
Yes. Too much pressure, unrealistic pressure, unneeded.
Absolutely. And how do you gauge rather the difference between complaining and asking for help, or complaining and, having real suffering?
Certainly. Yeah, no, you can't.
Mm-hmm.
And so I misjudged. I didn't value that I had needs, because being high maintenance was something that I did not want to be.
Mm-hmm.
I did not want to be a woman who was quote unquote high maintenance, and that I had to debunk quickly. It's like, no, I have needs, and I have legitimate needs.
Right.
I have basic human needs and other needs to be a person. And no one was telling me explicitly I couldn't have them, but there was just some understanding or wiring within me that was telling me, no, like, you don't need to have needs. And so getting to realize that is erroneous was also a part of my healing journey. And now modeling for my children, mommy needs to go to the bathroom. Mommy needs to eat breakfast. Just not so much as I telling them that I need it, but also to remind myself and to have me hear myself say it, and to identify it and validate and model for them that mommies can have needs and need to attend to them. And I'm a better mommy when I take care of myself first. Thank you for your patience, things like that.
Yeah, fantastic. So by the time you were feeling really, let me restate that. By the time you really realized that you weren't doing well, you maybe had been suffering for some time?
Yes, I would say that very related to I had been suffering. I'd say around 4 months postpartum, I would just start to I had no patience, and I would just get enraged and frustrated and irritated because I had needs that were not being met. And then I would meet my basic needs. I would just be a puddle of tears, and my parents would come help me. My husband was working on a weekend, and they would take the kids and kind of have these confused looks on their face, like, oh my gosh, like, you're so upset. Like, why? And they would just take the kids, and I would shower and sleep all day, and then feel rejuvenated and like, okay, I'm good. I can keep going. And I would, but I would have these breakdowns every like 6 to 8 weeks. And I would, my things that my then 3-year-old would say would just irritate me. I just had skin crawling, irritation and agitation. And so I also didn't self-identify as having depression. Like I thought someone being depressed was like in bed and couldn't get out of bed.
Yeah.
I was very functional, and I was having these rage episodes versus being rendered, just needing to be in bed. So I also didn't know the extent of symptomology that could be considered depression, or a mix of depression and anxiety. So I wasn't educated, maybe because it was assumed I was so well educated. But
that happens. That happens for sure. But across the board, people could use a little bit more heads up about this.
Certainly.
For sure. Yeah.
And I also didn't feel connected to my pediatricians to share anything. I remember in the beginning, there was some inconsistency of who we saw for different appointments. And I didn't feel like I could disclose like how things were really going. And I think those were really missed opportunities. And like when I wanted to say something, but didn't know how to break the ice to say it, I was hoping they would give me the screener at that appointment. And they didn't. I was like, wait, where's the screener to like have it be the icebreaker? I'm like, and yes, I'm not doing well. And so if they had given it to me at my 6-month checkup, if they had the well baby check, if they'd given it to me at the 8-month, they really would have caught me then. But even at the 6-month, I might have gotten picked up. Or at least seen for myself, you're not doing so good. And like, that's okay. But it would have been that rough time for reflection for me.
Yeah.
That I didn't get. So that's definitely one thing that I've talked to our pediatrician about and asked them to get to put into practice in their practice of screen mothers longer. I would have been caught. I could have been supported.
Good for you. That is awesome that you're able to go back to them and tell them about this, or at least advocate for other parents.
Yeah.
Because it could be caught so much sooner if we were looking more frequently.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a lot to go through. And I know we're just getting bits and pieces of what it was like for you. But the amount of like internal turmoil, I guess, that it sounds like you were dealing with, and nobody around you really, really knew.
Right. My husband knew, and that was about it until I kind of broke my silence to my mom and then my longtime gynecologist and was just like, so being a parent, a mother of two is terrifying me. And I think I need help.
And you had mentioned your high sensitivity also in general, specifically to medication, but it sounds like also just as a person, a highly sensitive person.
Yes. No, I mean, like I already had the yard level noise canceling headphones to be able to tolerate my baby screaming, and definitely sensitive to sound. Both my husband and I are. It's a strategy that we use of putting those on, even in this last week to just keep ourselves regulated. And I'm very much the highly sensitive parent that Dr. Erin describes, really getting a lot out of her new book. And historically, I mean, I remember as a high schooler identifying as a highly sensitive person. And I did not put it together of that I will always be a highly sensitive person.
Right.
So these major life transitions, to take that into account, that would have, hindsight, of course, is 2020. That would have been nice to like, okay, we're going to have this big change. Also remember you're highly sensitive and there might be some modifications and adaptations you need to make or account for to be successful.
Totally. Absolutely. So to that point, I think that you were noticing in and around 8 months that you weren't doing so well, and your conscientiousness around your own profession, but also around the development of your second daughter, you began to be worried about her language development. Is that what I heard?
Yeah, I was concerned that I was putting her at risk. I mean, I was not deeply familiar, but I had, understood the research to say that kids whose mothers are depressed and have, varying mental illnesses are at risk for language delay. And that is something that I did research some more and found evidence to support. And so was even more motivated to assure that whoever was spending time with my child, we did end up having to get a nanny to do some caregiving, that I took the time to train her and tell her why I wanted her to name the things that my daughter was playing with, talk about things in a book, and not just read the story, but talk about the items on the page and notice what ones were also in the space with her. To both my kids are raised bilingual. We speak Spanish and English at home, and to whoever could be speaking Spanish to the youngest, I mean, to all of them, to continue to do that, and just reminding people to keep talking to them, singing with them, engaging with them in a typical way, not excessively, and that I couldn't do my part. So to help me and to make sure that was happening.
For you yourself, were noticing more silence or less communication?
Yeah, less communication, or I wasn't as talkative or interested in talking so much, or I was just so overstimulated and overwhelmed by the job of parenting that I would do the absolute necessary and then need to take a break and leave and get away. And so, but that was also hard because the voice in my head that's not so positive would be like, well, but aren't you kind of being a little obsessive about how you're training the nanny, or, isn't that being a little overbearing? And I really had to check that voice and say, and per my professional hat of, no, I'm not being overbearing. I am being conscientious, and I'm being thoughtful to provide early intervention for my child so she doesn't have a language delay and isn't impacted by what's going on with me. So kind of being clear with myself about why I was training the nanny or asking her to do things very explicitly, even though she had a lot of experience with kids and liked being with kids and was inherently great. I still made the effort to talk about these things in an explicit way that was uncomfortable for me to do, but I was really glad that I did it, and it went really well, and she was really receptive, and I mean, I was paying her, so I mean, she should do it how I want her to do it. But that was also uncomfortable for me to even get to that point of hiring someone to watch my kids. That was a whole nother mental sparring.
Sure. If you're a perfectionist, then you should be able to do it yourself. Is the whole line. Obviously, we know that that's not like accurate. Well, for one, perfection isn't possible, and two, everybody needs help.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's quite a lot of pressure. Yeah. And so you had mentioned in that process some of the cultural factors going into this, that as the mother should be able to do everything.
Yeah. My dad's from Mexico and my mom's from Minnesota. And I just by observing, I think but my dad is from a really large family, and my aunts have had lots of kids. My dad's one of 13. So my grandmother had a lot of kids. So I just assumed by observation, no conversation, just purely observation and slightly erroneous observation, that everyone loved motherhood. It was easy there because they had multiple children and they seemed to be fine. Granted, I didn't see these people very often or were very close to them. So it was not really based in reality, but I was functioning off of like, well, if they can do it, then I can do it. And if kind of complaining is not valued, I didn't want to complain about it, because they would say, well, I could look to my aunts, say, well, they had 4 kids and they seemed fine. And, I only have 2. I also worked with primarily Spanish-speaking families and would see these mothers, Spanish-speaking mothers, doing amazing things with, 3, 4 children in a very small space, and, very little support during the day. When I would do some home visits, and they were managing, they were doing well. I was, there to help with their, a child that may have a communication delay, but I was just so in awe of how they did it all. And granted, it was 1 hour in their whole week and I didn't see the other things, but in that time, I convinced myself that they were doing it all. They were living up to the ideal of being mother and wife. And it was fulfilling in all ways. And that wasn't my experience. So I thought then I was failing.
Wow. No pressure at all.
No.
That's so it's just coming from every angle, even professionally. So, right. So in your own process, then you were aware of that you yourself needed help and that your daughter may need help or support and early intervention, as you said. How did this experience, shape you in terms of your own postpartum depression, intersecting with what you do for a living?
It's really given me pause to, well, one, the job that I'd been doing, I went back to it temporarily and then changed jobs. I made the shift to become a supervisor and a clinical supervisor. And now I train graduate students to be speech language pathologists. And in my position as the director of our kind of young child clinic, I'm able to talk to them about maternal and parental mental health as it relates to when we talk about home visiting, which is a typical way of service delivery between birth to 3, and is, the natural environment is what's delineated as best practice for IDEA and things like that. That when we're working with parents in kind of parent coaching, we need to be aware of their mental health, of their background. Who's the adult learner that we have in front of us that is going to be collaborating and learning from us to then help their child? Right. If they have a history of depression, or if they're going through late onset postpartum, like what are the signs and symptoms that you might see doing an ethnographic interview? What are the signs and symptoms that you might see in your home visit that might give you a hint that they could use some more supports, and you could make some suggestions of, even educating them of, did they know that maybe they're having some symptoms of postpartum, that this could still be considered postpartum depression. And here's, the international postpartum international resources or local resources, and kind of, put them in touch with community supports. But I think just having that awareness to have the patients and to also gauge how many ideas do you give them if you know that they're in an era of intense sleep deprivation. Like really explaining to my students, who fortunately the range of students is, they can be typical, kind of traditional students or non-traditional students. So some students are young and don't have their own kids and may or may not want to be parents, but some, have been parents and things like that. So there's a wide range of personal experience, but kind of going for the mean of not having a child yet, to educate them on, these are the cognitive impairments that happen with sleep deprivation. And here, can you kind of like, how ready to learn is your learner who's in front of you? And trying to take in all these other be sure to take in all this, the context of each person and each family, to then be able to kind of attend to the needs of their child best.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm really happy to hear you talk about this from the parent-child perspective, in part because with the clients that I meet with who are anxious or depressed, or who have felt disconnected from their children in the early postpartum or for a little while, they are sometimes worried about their kids' language development, or even worried that, oh my gosh, because I was anxious or depressed, did I cause a speech delay or something like that? So I was wondering if first you could give us a kind of a broad overview of what's kind of quote unquote normal language development, whatever that means, but more specifically like a range of when it's common for kids to start talking.
Yeah. Well, the amazing thing about kids and people and our human system of communication is that hearing is really important, and hearing develops really early on. So our babies, if they're born with typical hearing, have been hearing a lot of the pregnancy. And so they're already really used to our voice and are primed and ready they're orienting to us upon birth. And so they can't see very well for about the first 4 months. They can't see very well. So talking to them and interacting with them, getting really close to their face, literally within like 6 to 12 inches of their face, is important. So really getting up in their face and talking with them, but they're going to be making sounds. I was always amazed when my daughters made sounds that they didn't talk about in my training, of like these squeaks and coo, that like the degree of the range of coos that they could make. When I heard it for myself, for my own children, was so amazing. So they'll be making all different kinds of sounds and beginning to then those kind of squeaks and certain coos will stop pretty early on, but they'll make different sounds and different vowels and start kind of playing with their mechanism, with their voice, with their throat, with the pitch or the sounds that they can make, and be making what we call kind of front sounds. So kind of those M's and P's and B's, kind of where in lots of cultures, mama and ma are kind of terms for mother, and ba or pa are terms for father, because those other consonants come very early. So sounds will come, and then also the children have receptive language, so their understanding of language is developing all the time. So it's kind of harder to gauge, but you talking about something and then they looking at it with you, their eye gaze is telling you, I know what you're talking about. I'm looking at what you're talking about. And so it's important to kind of watch for and the kind of show and tell of things, so that you're sharing, and it's called joint attention. You're both looking at something and maybe looking back at each other and then looking back at the item of the show. And all those types of things are happening early on.
I love your explanation of receptive language, and so that parents can understand that even if their kids aren't specifically talking, they're still building and working towards talking. So yeah, can you expand a little bit more on what talking might look like?
Yeah. So they've been doing all this work, this foundational work of that receptive language. And they've also kind of been making those sounds, which is that's part of their expressive language. So have started making different types of noises, but then you'll start to see around 10 months to 14 months, them kind of condensing those consonants, those B's and P's and some of the vowels they've been saying. And they might start saying some true words like mom, mama, or up, or mo for more in English. And so you can expect to start to see just a handful of words in that range, about 10 to 14 months, because it also depends on the other gross motor and fine motor development that the baby's been doing, because they're really busy those first 12 months. So really kind of talking starts after kids are walking. Kind of coordinating their whole body is needed before they can coordinate their mouths. So more words, maybe 5 to 25 words, is kind of what you're looking at 18 months. And then from 18 months to 2 years is you want to see a real explosion of language. And it's really exciting because in such a short amount of time, they're really starting to put more words in their vocabulary, and you're really getting to know this little person that you've been caring for. It's really exciting.
It is. You just gave me a flashback to both of my kids' language development periods, and how fun it was and how amazing it was to just almost see their little brains work and trying to put stuff together, and how fun it is for us, but how fun it is for them. And
Yeah, they're getting to be human, expressive.
right. Right. It's really cool. And they're probably like, finally, you understand what I'm trying to tell you.
Right, right. And to be sure, those handful of true words in that 10 to 14 months, that could also include signs. So it could be a mixture of signs and spoken words. So all together, that would be the child's kind of vocabulary. And even as they go and their language is expanding, if they're still using signs as well, that also counts towards their kind of summative vocabulary.
Can I ask you another question? I have a lot of clients who they themselves are bilingual, and some of them are, speaking just one language at home, which is not English,
Uh-huh.
and letting other people speak to their kiddos in English. And their concern is like, oh well, my kids don't seem to be developing language as quickly as others, or like, how is this going to impact them? And I've heard that kids who are bilingual or in bilingual or multilingual homes sometimes do have a little bit of expressive timing difference. Is that true?
It is true in the sense that they're juggling different languages
Mhm.
and they do not get confused,
Mhm.
and they may be a little slower on the expressive part, but
Mhm.
then once they get going, they've got both, or they've got all three, or however many they are managing. So it is not put the child at risk for a language delay by any
Mhm.
means.
Mhm.
And actually, they're getting to use more of their brain than
Mhm.
monolinguals, which is fascinating to see. In my daughters, I've seen problem solving, I feel
Mhm.
like is more, the agility to do that is improved because they're bilingual. So it will be it's within normal limits
Mhm.
compared to a monolingual, but maybe towards the lower end of expressive, but they're also multilingual. So
Very
it's
cool.
comparing it to a monolingual, they may seem on the slower side or the lower end of typical, but they're within, for bilinguals to bilinguals, they're strongly within normal limits.
Super cool. The brain is
Yeah.
awesome. I think it's really important that that you're delineating that language is a process, and
Hmm.
it's not just if they're talking or not as part of language.
Yeah,
'Cause
no,
I think
it's so much more than that. We've got that
yeah.
receptive language, and then social language. So very early on, I, like within weeks from my older daughter, I spoke only Spanish to her, and she would look me in the eye and know that I was talking to her. I
Mhm.
would start speaking English in her presence, close to her face, like same position, and be speaking to my husband. And her gaze would kind of look away and not be looking at me, and she could tell I wasn't talking to her.
Mhm.
And then I
Sure.
go back to speaking Spanish, and she would just zoom in and be looking right at me,
Mhm.
focused at me. She knew that she was being spoken to. And
Mhm.
it's amazing to watch kind of the back and forth that can happen of people talking to a baby and pausing, and the baby making sounds and vocalizations back.
Yeah.
That's the beginning of a conversation. That
Mhm.
back and forth and is important. Just the fact that the baby is making
Mhm.
noise is important. It may not
Absolutely.
be into words yet or sounds, at the developmental stages, but that expressiveness is important.
So for the parents out there who are dealing with depression or anxiety and are worried, I guess either about their child's language development, or at least are feeling maybe similarly to how you described you felt, that not feeling like engaging, not wanting
Hmm.
to do that. Or feeling like a lot of work to be able to engage in that way. You gave one tip, which is to find other people to do it, and have some other people make sure that they're interacting. But what are some other things you could you yeah, what are some options for parents in terms of interacting with their kids and supporting language development when they themselves, the parent, is not feeling well?
Yeah. First of all, I would say it's okay not to have someone speaking to your child all the time, and to really tune into yourself and think about a time in your day when you do have energy. Think about what time of day that is. And hopefully it happens every day. You might have like 5 minutes you feel like you could really be intentional and talkative. And it can be hard to find those moments because we don't feel like ourselves, and we're
Right.
struggling. And, even that could be a tall ask. So again, having a partner, having family members, friends that are like family, and in the event of COVID, that's its own extra
Right.
thing. But, periods of times where the baby can have someone talking to them, or you yourself can talk about, if you need to unload the dishwasher, talk about what you're doing. Doesn't have to be just like this one-on-one undivided attention to the baby. Baby can be nearby. You're referring to them, glancing towards them, but you need to fold the laundry or unload the dishwasher, or you're making the bed, and you can be talking about what it is that you're doing, of like, oh, I'm folding your baby socks. And next time is, my shirt, and here's daddy's red, sweatpants. And so just kind of labeling and talking about things. And maybe for the duration of the activity is all that you have to feel talkative right then. And your task got done that you feel like you needed to do, and you were talking about what you're doing. So kind of, you could check it off in your mind of like, okay, I gave them some input that was of quality. Reading a book, and even just like looking at pages and having, some silence is good too. Having the baby look, and you can just kind of point at what the baby's, looking at. Lots of times for really young books, there's only like 1 or 2 images on the page. And so you can, it's like, oh, there's the bunny. I see a bunny. Bunnies hop. There's probably only 1 word on the page. You could make up a story if that felt creative. Because also, like, the time you spend with your kids when you're not feeling great, you want to enjoy doing it. So thinking of something that you enjoy and they enjoy, and then hopefully if it's something that happens regularly, like in a routine, that's a great way to know that, like, okay, tomorrow at the same time, I'm looking forward to this time. And maybe it's 5 or 10 minutes that you're really just kind of giving intention to be more talkative, talk about what you're doing, label things for the child. And then other times, maybe you don't feel talkative, but you're having music on for the baby. And then they're going to go for a walk with somebody, or you're going to go for a walk with the baby, and they're getting to look outside. And, maybe you could notice things if you feel like you could do that. But I think really kind of picking a time that you shine in your day, even if it's for 5 minutes, and just know, like, okay, for these 5 minutes every day, like, I can commit to that. And I think just knowing that making that much time every day happens at least. And then you might be surprised the more you care for yourself and see that counselor, take that medication, or get that acupuncture or whatever it is that is how you're helping yourself, that you might find other moments that you could add to that. But knowing on a really hard day, I did my 5 minutes, and that's okay. And I'm talking to people about the importance of supporting my child's language.
These are just gems. I'm so grateful that you're bringing all of these tips in, because I know how many people can use them. And what I want to highlight from what you said is that, if 5 minutes is what you can do, that's fine. I hear sometimes almost the opposite from people who feel like they have to constantly be stimulating their children and doing something and engaging them and whatnot. And like, you don't need to constantly be doing it either. And sometimes they need their own break. Like kids need silence and to have a chance to look around and, be curious and whatnot. We somewhere in the middle is fine.
Yes, exactly.
A little bit of interaction, a little bit of distance.
Yeah, that tummy time and that pause. Babies and kids have processing time. So even if they are using some words or are making some sounds, they need time to process, to respond to us. So if anything, part of my healing journey was to slow down and learn how to rest and what that meant, and not feel guilty about it. And then also just being able to pause in those conversations with your kids, that lets them show up. Because if we're taking up all this airspace, there's no place for them to show up. So if you're feeling less talkative, that's okay. That's where you are that day, in that moment, those weeks, those months. And the more resourced you are, the more talkative you'll want to be in a real purposeful way.
So I would love to also know more. Clearly, you have so many good gems, both from your professional experience and personal experience. And I assume that when you said you were writing before, that you were writing about your experience. And I know you've mentioned that you have a memoir. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah. I started writing really to kind of save my life. And I've been working with Molly Carroll May, who's an author of The Body Full of Stars and her postpartum memoir. And it's been a journey to take things that were kind of reflective pieces. And I had so much of it that when I took it to Molly, I was like, Molly, I think this could be a book. And I think other mothers and parents and, communities could be helped by this. Yeah. And so she really supported me to complete a manuscript, which I have, and I've been trying to solicit it to publishers as well as agents and things like that. So it's kind of taking it on a life of its own in the sense of I'm less anxious about when it comes out, though I would love for it to come out sooner rather than later. So I'm still in that kind of the learning curve of how do you get a book published, what's thing. So it's with some people having some other read-throughs right now, having been with some agents and kind of getting some feedback. So that's hopefully forthcoming. But
exciting.
Thank you. It's kind of it's a hybrid of my experience, a kind of memoir, but also this research that I found, and things that I don't think have made it really into mainstream. That really, at least for my training as a speech language pathologist, I learned that there's a better prognosis with education of the diagnosis. And so once I could learn more about what was happening to my brain anatomically, biochemically, I could have more patience with myself. And I just had more of a context about, okay, this is what I'm working with. This is about how long it will take to, recuperate my adrenals and work through that adrenal fatigue. And so it just helped me heal with just that education. So I want to, share those things. As well as my kind of personal journey of my insights into meeting and befriending my inner critic and meeting my inner child and seeing how she was inadvertently sabotaging my parenting and why setting boundaries were so hard. They still are hard, but they were even more hard then and things like that. So
Oh, fantastic. That's great. I mean,
from my readers who've been versed, they're like, this is so great. I've learned so much. And
it's very useful for people to have information and education on what's available to them, even if, let's say, they hear all the steps you took in your healing journey and they decide that one or two of them might work for themselves. But, they didn't know about it before. It's not like somebody has to do your exact healing journey in order to also feel well, but that you're sharing it and making that public for other people to learn from, along with researched information and education and whatnot that supported you. I think it's so valuable. It's a winning combo.
Thank you. Yeah. When everything was kind of shattering around me, I thought, I can't be the only one this is happening to.
Right.
Like I have to take notes. I have to write, I have to document because this is so hard. And it's not going to have just been me that gets through it. Okay. There's other moms that I could feel that it either has happened and it was a long time ago for them and they need validation, or it hasn't happened to them yet and they need some guideposts, but it just felt bigger than me. And if one mom is helped because she reads it, that was the whole point. It was that was enough.
Absolutely. I'm sure you will reach way more people than that.
That's the hope.
What's really interesting about putting stuff out there, even like a podcast like this, or certainly a book, is you don't ever really know, once it leaves your mouth, once it leaves your hands and your mind, it goes out into the world and you don't know where it's going to end up and how it's going to impact people. And you'll be lucky to hear back from a couple of people, but it is always more impactful than, the handful of people you might hear back from. It's just, everybody will get the gem that they need, and whoever needs to find your book will find it.
Right. I trust that.
Yeah. Well, I thank you so much for coming on and sharing your experience and your knowledge. I just know that a lot of these gems, along with your personal experience, are going to be so helpful for our listeners.
No, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you once again, Emily. Really, really, really valuable information here. If you guys would like to get connected with Emily, please find her online and on Instagram at Emily Adler Mosqueda. For those of you listening, please do share this episode with whoever you think could benefit from this information and support. If you've been listening for a while, then you know how important it is to share this information. Make sure people have the awareness that these conditions and these situations exist so that they know they can get the help that they need. Thank you so much for being with us. Until next time. Thank you so much for joining us today. Please share this podcast. Together we can support moms and families so that no one has to deal with this alone. Come connect with us at momandmind.com.